Call the meeting of the Planning Commission to order this August 21st, 2019. If staff could call roll, please.
Connie Coleman-Lackady.
Present.
Don Daniels.
Here.
James Guerrero.
Here.
Nancy Hudson-Eccles is excused. Ryan Pearson.
Here.
Paul Wagaman is excused. Christopher Weber.
Here.
You have quorum.
Thank you. Before us, we have the minutes of August 7th, 2019. Looking for a motion.
I move that we accept the minutes as presented.
Ms. Connie Coleman-Lackady has a first.
Second.
Motion and a second. Any discussion, changes? Hearing or seeing none at this time. All those in favor by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none. Motion in the minutes passed as written. Thank you. Any changes to our agenda tonight by staff?
No, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Okay, we'll move to number 5, public comment. Getting a lot of feedback up
Yeah.
here. Sorry. Maybe that will be a little bit better. Thank you. So public comment tonight, allowing the public to speak to the fellow commissioners. You'll have 3 minutes to speak. If you come up to the podium and state your name and the city that you reside, we appreciate that. I do have 2 individuals that have signed up. Others, if they didn't sign up, we'll ask you at the, when these 2 individuals come up, we'll ask if there anyone else would like to speak. First, we have Gregory Bush. If you come on up, like I mentioned, state your name and the city you reside.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Gregory Bush. I'm with Wireless Policy Group, and I'm here tonight on behalf of AT&T. I'd like to thank the Commission for the opportunity to comment on the proposed code change, specifically the section dealing with wireless, and we appreciate the chance to review the draft code in advance. I'd like to thank Ms. Spear for sending the draft around and allowing us to provide comments. Most of AT&T's suggestions for the wireless code change are in wording and consistency, internal consistency, as well as with federal law. But one issue stands out in our minds, and that is that the current draft of the code, forgive me for not getting the exact page, but I have it marked as page 429 of 450, and that's the red line that AT&T submitted. This is this section dealing with the siting priorities for small wireless facilities. And small wireless facilities are designed to be much smaller than macro facilities, the giant towers that you're probably more familiar with. And because they're small, this a smaller scale and more of a targeted solution for coverage and capacity needs, AT&T doesn't think that the zoning as it's drafted or at all really is applicable to this small wireless facilities. Specifically, the zoning restrictions and priorities are that they go on water towers, on public structures, and these are uses that small wireless facilities are not designed for. It's why water towers are too far from where the use is needed and where the capacity is needed. And most of our, and all of our designs that I've seen have been meant for use on poles, light standards, utility poles in the public rights-of-way, not on private or public buildings. So that's one issue with that. And the other issue is that zoning restrictions don't particularly make sense because if that may apply to macro facilities that can cover large distances. Small wireless facilities are meant as, again, a targeted response to a specific and local need in the immediate vicinity. So AT&T suggests deleting that particular section. And finally, another issue, smaller issue is that AT&T recommends in the design standards for small wireless facilities, the language including flexibility as technology evolves. This is really the tip of the spear for 5G, and small wireless facilities are paving the way for that. The designs will change as 5G evolves and we get a better idea of what the technology will look like. So in our suggested comments, we provide language, say, we shall conform to this design as close as technically feasible. For example, 5G antennas, and I'm sorry if I'm over time, 5G antennas cannot currently be shielded. They can't be put behind shrouds. So when we say it shall conform to a particular standard as close as technically feasible. If a design cannot be incorporated for technical reasons, then that essentially prohibits the design from being used. And that's not in compliance with federal law, and then there's no way for staff to approve that. So AT&T suggests including a kind of flexibility, including language for technical feasibility. And thank you again for the chance to comment, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Next, Devendra? How did I do?
Good evening, commissioners and city staff. My name is Devendra Maharaj. With Verizon Wireless, I work out of the Network Engineering Office in Bellevue, Washington. So thank you for this opportunity to speak. I'll keep this very brief. Verizon is just very excited to be working with the city of Lakewood to better improve the service here. We've had a chance to review the code, and we believe it to be a very good code, a very workable code, with very minor changes needed that we've provided to the city staff. Tonight, I am just here to show our support to the city staff and to the commissioners and to the city of Lakewood, and we are available should you have any questions or concerns for us. With that, thank you. Have a good day. Good night.
Good questions?
Question?
No? See none. Thank you so much.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it. Okay, those are the two that signed up. Anyone else wishing to speak tonight? Go right ahead and.
My name's Tim Purrier. I reside in the city of Tacoma, but my corporate office is here in Lakewood at the Lakewood Industrial Park. We're just kind of getting on the front end of this 18A discussion, and since the Lakewood Industrial Park is a big part of the industrial business park zone, it's very important to Northwest Building, the owner of that property, that we get it right. I've been working very diligently with staff, and they've been very receptive to comments. And hopefully when we get to the public comment period, I'll be able to heartily recommend that portion of the zone. But I did want to say you've got a lot of work ahead of you. It's a very complex change, and I wish you luck. And if you have any questions about the Lakewood Industrial Park, the IBP zone or anything, I'm more than happy to help. So thank you.
Hey, thank you so much. Thanks for coming. Appreciate it. So we have one more person in the audience. You want to have anything to say tonight, Glenn? Nothing? Okay. Seeing or hearing none, we'll close the public comment at this particular time. We have no public hearing, and we'll move to number 7, new business, and area-wide zoning map amendment of parcels from OSR2 to OSR1 under permit process number, whatever number that is, of the Lakewood Municipal Code.
Yeah.
Okay, Ms. Spear.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the Planning
I could
Commission.
went on for more, long.
I tried to come up with a better name of how to do this, but it's just a complicated title. I don't know. So what we're talking about is called an area-wide rezone. And within the Lakewood the Lakewood Municipal Code, there are 5 different processes for applying for review and approval of either a permit or an amendment to the comprehensive plan or a map. And this again is an area-wide rezone. These are 6 parcels that are just to the north of Western State Hospital, and they comprise most, if not all, of what used to be the Fort Steilacoom Golf Course. And by saying it's a process for review, it comes to the Planning Commission, and then it moves along to the City Council for approval. This is not a redesignation, meaning changing the land use designation for those parcels because they're already open space, but it is a rezone. So I remember we talked about this last time, I think, about how you can have multiple zones within a land use designation in our zoning map. This is changing the zones, but without having to change the map. So there's not a need to amend the comprehensive plan. This can be done at any time, and this is something that the City of Lakewood is initiating. The changes would make those 6 parcels rezoned from OSR2, or Open Space and Recreation 2, to Open Space and Recreation 1. And again, I just mentioned this in some detail, but here under Lakewood Municipal Code 18A02 502, you see that this is something that goes through public notice and comment, and that was done. The Planning Commission is hearing about it tonight, and then, yeah, it'll be a month from now, sorry, September 18th, there'll be the public hearing for this process, and then the Planning Commission after that would be taking up its decision in October. And then, once the Planning Commission makes a recommendation, the council will consider this. Should anybody want to appeal the council's recommendation or decision, it would go to Superior Court. And then these criteria probably look somewhat familiar to you, but these are the ones that are used for a rezone consideration. So these are the things that, as the Planning Commission prepares to make its recommendation, are the criteria that you would be looking at, and they are in fact the same as what you would see for a comprehensive plan amendment, which is why they'd be familiar. But to walk through them quickly, the proposed amendment would be consistent with the comprehensive plan itself. It would be compatible with development in the vicinity. It will not unduly burden the transportation system, nor will it unduly burden the public services and facilities serving the property, which with any impacts that can't be mitigated. It will not adversely impact public health, safety, and welfare. The range of uses in the requested zone is more appropriate than the range in the existing zone. Circumstances have changed substantially. I'm sorry, that is related specifically to comprehensive plan amendments, unless Dave wants to correct me there. And then on number 8, the negative impacts of the proposed change are outweighed by the advantages. So those are your 8 criteria that you would be looking at as we move forward with this item. Here are some maps to orient you to what we're talking about. On the top right are just the parcels. So again, these are what used to be the Fort Silicon Golf Course for the most part. There are 3 stars or arrows on the top. Then there's that middle larger parcel, which is a 4th right in between, or right across the word Stillicum is that parcel boundary. And then there's a larger one to the south. And then that bottom right arrow and star, you'll notice that one is actually only a partial rezone of a 6th parcel, which is much larger and goes further south. So we are talking about 5 complete parcels getting rezoned, and then 1 that would be partially rezoned. And you'll see on the bottom map where the big star is, we are not changing the boundaries at all. We're just using the boundaries of the current OSR 2 zone and saying let's move all of those into OSR 1 instead. On that bottom right map, you see the green, which is the open space designation, and then below that is the blue, that is public institutional. That again is the Western State Hospital campus. The white road is Stillicum Boulevard, and then below that in the green, that is Fort Stillicum Park. And then the bottom left map, again, of this same area is just an aerial view. You get to see what is actually physically on the property. You'll see to the northern boundary of what we're talking about is residential. And then down below is, I actually cut part of it off when I did this map, but you'll see the golf course patterns there, and then some additional residential and other types of uses off to the east. So the differences between open space and recreation 1 and 2, for the most part, or generally speaking, OSR 1 is more passive, less intense uses. And then within the OSR 2, there are currently some uses that are either allowed by administrative approval or conditional approval that would not be allowed in any circumstance in OSR 1, including community and cultural services, amusement and recreation, funeral services, and lodging. And this is a more detailed comparison between the uses that are either permitted outright, administratively approved, or conditionally approved between OSR 1 and OSR 2. Again, what is currently on the property is OSR 2, so that column to the right is what could go on there currently. OSR 1 is what the city is proposing to rezone those 6 parcels to become. So I'll just leave this here if there's any questions or thoughts or.
Mr. Guerrero.
So is there a proposal for something to go on the property, or is what's driving the?
No, this is simply to better reflect, and this actually arose during the comprehensive plan cycle at the city council level this last cycle. It's not an intent to put anything specific on it, but it's just simply to better reflect what is currently on the property. Not only what uses are currently on the property, but the environmental constraints. And I see Mr. Beers put his light on.
Also, too, this was at the request of the city council to take a look at revisiting the open space zoning, and this was part of a resolution of intent that was adopted in the first quarter of 2019.
So this is pretty short and sweet, but tonight is just an introducing this issue to you. On September 18th will be the public hearing, and then because of scheduling with 18A and some other items, this will be back to you on October 16th for recommendation to the city council. So are there any questions on it?
If I could, Ms. Spear.
Yeah.
The property owner is Pierce County?
There's actually a couple different ones. Part of it is Pierce County, part of it is, they just call it Washington State, and then part of it is the Department of Natural Resources. So 3 at least.
So
different parcel
those
owners.
entities then would have the right to discuss or comment or whatever way favor, yes or no.
Yes.
I noticed the notices have been sent out in this public hearing. Any idea of what, or have you had any comments or anything as of yet? Nothing?
No, the public notice actually just went out yesterday and today, so it's going to be hitting people's mailboxes probably starting tomorrow. I will say that some city staff today actually had a meeting with the Western State Hospital construction and civil engineering planning folks, and we let them know that this was underway as well. So we may also hear from Western State Hospital specifically, in part because what we found out today, there is on that partial parcel, the one that's going to be kind of cut off because of the current zoning, there's actually an overlap to one of their buildings. And so there may need to be some discussion about that as we move forward. But they heard about this stuff today. They were actually the first ones probably to get notified. So we'll see if they're here too on the 18th.
Mr. Branstetter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In response to Mr. Pereira's question and Mr. Buer's comment, that this was an issue that the City Council did ask staff to look at. The current zoning was in place initially when we became a city, in part because it reflected there was an active golf course there, which we made OSR 2 thing to make that compliable. That golf course is closed, and the City Council is aware that this particular area serves as a buffer between the public institutional uses and the residential uses in the Oak Brook neighborhood, and wanted to look at what zoning was most appropriate to maintain a buffer between those two, because there are a number of reasons why a buffer is beneficial.
Any other questions from Ms. Spear? Hearing or seeing none, thank you so much.
All right, thank you. So I will set this aside and we'll come back to it for the public hearing, as I said, in a month. And then we get to jump into your favorite and mine. Here we go. And I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, that you weren't here last time.
I tried to read all of that when
You
I'm
got
on
your
vacation.
450-page
Yeah.
packet?
Yeah, uh-huh.
$20 my time.
Yep.
Well, what was provided to you this evening for tonight's meeting actually was not the full 18A. It was simply a summary of some of the changes that have occurred to the draft between August 7th and August 21st. And so I'll walk through that with you tonight. But just again, and this was mentioned the first time we talked about this last meeting, this is still very much under review internally, and so we already know there's going to be additional edits between tonight and when you get your packet for the September 4th public hearing. And I know that that's somewhat frustrating that you're trying to read it and understand, and you're going to know that you have changes coming to some of the sections. I'm trying to give you a heads up tonight as to where those may be for the September 4th packet, but given the breadth and scope of this update, it's just, there's no way to get it all done in the first pass. So again, to go quickly over this, this is completely reorganized Title 18A of the code, which is the Land Use and Development Code. There are substantive amendments as well as the reorganization within Title 18A. There's new content, there's content being eliminated, there's content being edited and again moved around. In addition to that, though, there's also changes happening with Title III, which is Revenue and Finance. We talked about this last time, where information that came from 18A, 12, and 17, 3 titles of the code, all consolidating into Title III regarding financial guarantees and bonding and how to provide that option for developers to get their punch list toward the end of development and be able to finish things up after they hit that hurdle. So there are changes now, not only to 18A, but 3, 12, and 17. This is the chart that summarizes the various chapters in the current code on the left, and then in the shaded code or box on the right, you'll see the new 18A chapters. There are 11. Some of them have the same titles as the current code, but there is different content, so please don't assume that they're all the same. They're not. I'll just point to the bottom, since we had a couple of people tonight testifying regarding wireless. 18A95 is going to be where those code sections are housed. And what we have right now in place is an interim ordinance with interim regulations that was done on an emergency basis by the council at the start of the year in order to comply with the federal decision that occurred last October. But since that interim regulation set was put in place, this more formal and what's intended to be the permanent code has been worked on and proposed. So tonight, what we're going to do is just walk through again the changes that we were able to provide to you between August 7th and this evening. They focus on definitions and then the wireless service facility, some edits there. But I think between tonight and September 4th, and when you get that packet the week previous, you're going to see additional changes within the definition section again. We're trying to make that as broad and complete as possible to make this a more user-friendly code. There's going to be additional changes made to 18A40, that chapter which is related to land uses and what's allowed in each zone. And then again, there's going to be probably some additional changes to 18A95, the wireless service facilities. There's also still pending some administrative policies to be rolled into various sections of the code, so that'll be brought to your attention. And then there may also be some additional edits that come again from one more brush through by all of the staff, making sure we can catch as much as possible. This was provided to you last time, but again, Mr. Chair, for your benefit in particular, this is a table that summarizes where there's actually substantive changes. So yes, all 450 pages are worth reading in my opinion, but if you really want to focus your time, these are the sections where there's actual substantive change to process. And out of last meeting, so you're aware as well, Mr. Chair, Mr. Guerrero did mention that there were some things that were missed on this list, and I'm assuming some of that may come out tonight in the questions and answers, but we may well have missed some spots where there have been some changes. And this goes on for a couple of pages here. So this is the bulk of tonight's focus for 18A, and Mr. Buer is certainly going to be assisting me, but the idea was to provide the information to you last meeting, give you a couple of weeks to sit with it, and then see tonight if there were any questions that could be answered for you. But before I do that, I'm sorry, let me jump into the packet. So on page 5, you'll see the memo that related to our last topic, the rezones above Western State on the golf course. And then on page 18 is where the 18A amendments since the last meeting are summarized for you. Attachment A, which is on page 20, just shows you where we assume and anticipate changes to be coming. The highlighted sections on the left-hand side, the different uses, and then the highlighted column, IBP, or Industrial Business Park. We are assuming there will be edits there for you to view prior to the public hearing on September 4th, and that goes for a few pages. Then you'll see on pages 25, 26, 27, 28, just a very minor change regarding the word city and making sure we're doing that grammatically correctly, so no substantive there. Jumping ahead to page 34, again, you'll see the table and where IBP is mentioned and whether or not certain uses are conditionally allowed or outright permitted or prohibited. Same thing again on page 38 with governmental services. Utilities are on page 41. And then we get into the definitions section and changes that are being suggested as of tonight on page 44. So you'll see some additions that are related to the wireless service facilities, and then you will also see some changes that are simply cleaning up some of the terms within the section because there are multiple definitions for a single word. So for instance, under, on that first page 44, there's 2 different continuing care retirement community definitions. What we're proposing to do is combine those and just provide a single definition. Right above that, you'll see applicant, and there are 2 different definitions for applicant based on how it's referred to in particular parts of the code. So you'll see a couple more of those as you look through these other changes within the definitions section. For instance, the word person and then the word structure. Then you also have on page 48, or attachment C, some changes proposed within 18A20. And this is related again to wireless services. Some of these changes have already occurred here with input from our stakeholders. On page 49, you'll see a reference to Chapter 18A95 versus the previous interim ordinance, for instance. On page 52, you'll see discussion of wireless facilities permits. Attachment D, some changes to the Chapter 18A95 itself. And some of these, again, go to that just how do you use the word city is a number of times throughout the code. Changing the term wireless communications to wireless services. Reference to the fact that the appeal for the director's decision is directly to the Superior Court, which is on page 61. Noise and signs, there's a couple of tweaks there on page 65. So no signs of being allowed on antenna or towers unless required by governing law. And then under noise, macro facilities, so the large ones, the older 4G and lower, shall not produce noise in excess of limitations set forth in the city code. A little bit of edit on page 69, up at the top there under subsection B, talking about site selection and tower height. And that's talking about whether or not there can be something done shorter or taller based on technical feasibility. And one thing I wanted to mention actually as a reminder with the FCC decision from last October, I like to think of it as the government, the federal government is basically saying, look, we're in a shift in technology. This is a sea change for wireless services, and the railroad's coming through, folks, so get out of its way, to put it kind of crassly, I guess. But the point is that that decision doesn't leave a whole lot of wiggle room for local government. It's pretty clear on what has to happen. And so technical feasibility is one of those things where if a city or a county is trying to say, you have to do something this way, if the providers come back and say that's not technically feasible because of limitations in current technology or something else, that's something that has to be taken seriously by the local government, or else there's going to be appeal to the Superior Court on up that would probably have the decision come down in favor of the providers. Again, reference to city and services rather than communications for a number of times. There's some mention on page 74, leases of utility poles and who reviews those, which would be the director. On page 78, that new subsection E that is proposed, talking about commencing operations no later than 6 months after installation, but there is the opportunity to request a 6-month extension if there is, for some reason, a delay due to inability to connect to electrical or backhaul. And I think that's about all that's in there from tonight. Oh, I'm sorry, on pages 88 and 89, you'll see some discussion and change within 18A95-250, the design requirements for the new poles and deployments on pedestrian poles. So these sections, as they are tonight, I'll just put one more plug in there that is probably going to see some additional amendment by September 4th, but this is what we were able to provide you by tonight. So again, now coming back to you, are there questions? Are there areas of the code you'd like to spend some time on this evening? This is your time to ask questions.
Mr. Guerrero?
Yeah, regarding the small cell wireless, on page 81, talks about some of the restrictions, and the item D, it looks, so it talks about on private property, and it looks to me like there are no limitations. Am I reading that correctly? But besides, when you go further down, you see limitations on buildings and things, but I would interpret, so the previous page 80 gives you these items that the applicant would need to do, but these basically says on private property, they just need the owner's approval.
What this is talking about is that there is an assumption and a requirement actually by city code now that in order to place one of the 5G pieces of equipment on private property, you have to get the private property's owner's permission. And so as opposed to a franchise or some sort of other agreement between either the city and the provider or the power provider, the power pole owner, and the provider, you're dealing with the private property and getting their permission as well.
And that makes sense, except that it's in the category talking about things you can do. So, for example, A talks about concealing, but when you get to D,
Right.
It appeared to me like there are no restrictions. I'm sure there's permitting requirements, but no restrictions on, say, the aesthetic of it. Is that accurate?
May need to verify that.
And there's more a question, not necessarily saying we need to do something about it, but just understanding what we're agreeing to.
Yeah.
And I just from my own perspective, I was envisioning that we have these things all over the place, and some of those graphics we saw were fairly unsightly, but really they're not all over the place. So then I started thinking, well, maybe they're more like transformers, which we do have a fair amount of, and so maybe thinking of them that way, they're not as obtrusive as I'm initially thinking. But one thing that was mentioned tonight was that they can't be shrouded, and some of the graphics we saw from the presenter previous she was showing quite a bit of shrouding, and so.
And I quite frankly, I don't know if that is from carrier to carrier, there's different technology being used. So for instance, if AT&T doesn't shroud their facilities or their equipment, I don't know if Verizon already does, or T-Mobile already does or doesn't. So I'm not sure if we're in such a shift in the technology that certain carriers are doing certain things and others are doing different. But that's something that we can explore between now and September 4th and get you some more information.
And then also the graphics we saw last time, there were several kind of visual differences. And I'm wondering if we as a city can ask or require that even if they're coming from different vendors, that what we see is the same. So we're not seeing a square box here and a round box here and a triangular one somewhere else.
My gut is no,
No.
but we can find out and provide you a better answer than that for next time.
Okay. And my last question on that is, and I think I know the answer, but would they be allowed to have multiple vendors on the same pole?
There was conversation about that last time where in theory, yes. And the idea is if you can fit it on there and it's got the wind shear protection and the weight of the however many pieces of equipment are on there is going to still be safe, you could. Whether or not practically speaking it's doable is another question. But the idea is if a pole is there could be multiple vendors using that same pole. They may not consider it ideal. They may not be the wherewithal within the design of that pole to handle all that weight. And so you may have situations where you have one pole where one vendor is, and because one already got there, there will be another pole very nearby specifically for a different vendor. Yeah.
Any other questions? Mr. Buer?
If the commission would like, I can kind of walk you through the code page by page on some of the more substantive issues, and that might help beg some questions about why are we doing this? Are you kidding me? And that sounds perfectly fine. But if you don't mind, I would like to kind of go through that exercise, and it will be sort of fast and furious.
Okay.
And I'm going to sit because I have my paperwork in front of me. So it's going to be quick and I think informative at the same time. And if I'm going too fast, tell me to slow down.
Okay. Absolutely.
We're going to go to page 34 first.
And are you in the August 7th packet?
Yes, I am.
Does everybody have August 7th packet accessible?
Oh, August 7th?
Yes. Not today's.
Oh.
We're talking out of this guy now from last time.
Okay, then what I'm going to do is reference the section number and what it's about and what you can expect to see. On my page, okay, hold on.
This thing.
Okay. 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 The first thing on my document is on page 34, and it's boundaries, and this has to do with administrative determinations.
Is everybody there, August 7th?
Yep,
Oh,
You're good?
yep. Connie will.
it must be my fingers.
Okay.
Okay, on this section, you're going to see some changes in this language, and I'm going to go back to some of the existing code. I've gone through and looked at probably 10 different zoning ordinances on administrative determinations for zoning boundaries and tables and text. And no one does it very well, and what we're proposing to do is add a few things to provide greater clarification for the director who has to make the interpretation. So you'll see some additional language. On page 35 is 18A 10175.
This ain't it. On August 7th, this isn't it.
This isn't it?
No, sorry. It's not on,
Doesn't seem to be that deep.
Page 45.
of August 7th?
Yes.
Oh, God.
Yeah. Blows everything for me.
Oh, no. Sorry, Dave.
45 is fair housing requires.
Reasonable accommodations has to do, this is a new section. This piece is being required as a result of the Federal Fair Housing Act. This is something that is incorporated in all new zoning codes and allows people to request an administrative approval for for someone who has requesting some sort of what is the term? Accommodation. So this is used on a case-by-case basis. It might be that we have a zoning regulation that requires a certain setback, and that creates a specific problem for that individual. You could apply for a reasonable accommodation in accordance with the Federal Fair Housing Act. This will not come up very often, but I just wanted to let you know that's new. You'll see a lot of new definitions. You're going to see more definitions added over time, and I just wanted to let you know that. We have attempted to find a substantial change on page 65 of 450. Now, that has to do with wireless. The other thing is on page 69 of 450, you talk about group homes. This is taken directly out of our current code, and we put the definitions all in one place. So that's part of the reorganization that's going on. I won't go through all the the definitions, but you can see they're substantial, but they will be continued to be added on. The next major change is on page 106 of 450, and that's planning application type. We've gone through and added additional applications that were missed, and we've also went ahead and alphabetized it in the correct order.
Brian?
Yep. So in the definitions there, under the 18175, I don't know, 180, some of them are the same words that are defined two different ways. Is that typical, and how do you kind of know which one you're, I guess, getting?
That's part of, I'm sorry, that's part of what is getting changed. And if you look at the 21st, so tonight's packet, and I know we're making you jump all over the place, but in any attempt,
Those got combined?
there are some changes where they've been consolidated, and so you will not see that.
What you're seeing happening is this is a big task to put this together, and we've made a lot of changes, and trying to track it all has been kind of complicated. And so we're going through and sort of fine-tuning things, and so you're going to see changes here and there between now and prior to the commission making recommendations. But there's a lot here, and so I wanted to make sure that you were aware of some of the bigger items. The next topic is on page 109, review authorities, and getting that table correct is very important. So we're going to go through and just check that to make sure we haven't missed anything. On page 113, we start talking about non-conforming uses and structures. This section is a complete rewrite to our current non-conforming section. Certain things have been added. We're trying to address non-conforming parking lots on 117 and non-conforming landscaped areas, and we reorganized it a little bit differently so it's easier to read. In the current code, we kind of bury health and safety improvements in another section dealing with non-conforming. Here, we just made it its own separate section and paragraph. I think this is much easier to read. The other thing, too, is non-conforming uses and structures can be kind of a hairball. So on page 118, you see administrative determinations and review of determinations as well. Another important section begins on 119, the public notice requirements. We will be going through these tables to make sure we didn't miss anything. This becomes really critical in the review process for permits. This is more technical for city staff, but this is extremely important when we process permits to make sure the table's accurate. Moving on. Appeal procedures is also talked in here. That's found on page 129. And again, we'll be going through and verifying that we haven't missed any applications and the appropriate appeal process is correct. I'm thinking that we may also put this in some form of a table because we've placed everything else in tables. We also added a section on minor conditional use permit amendments or modifications. Getting a conditional use permit can be difficult because you have to go through the hearing examiner and there's a formal process. But sometimes there's a need to make minor amendments, and that is discussed in the new code. On the next subject is, if you start turning to on page 135, the comprehensive plan amendment piece, that's basically codifying what we're currently doing as part of the comprehensive plan docket, which we established as an administrative policy in 2018. So that now becomes, we're proposing to put that into code. The conditional use permit, cottage housing, land use review and approval, plan development, all those things are pretty much standard, except when you get to transitory accommodations. And transitory accommodations refers to temporary homelessness camps, and how would you approve or deny those applications. These are usually brought about most often by religious institutions. I will tell you that the state's got involved in this, and we have to be very careful of the language. The text that you have here is based upon another development code that we copied. And that is on page 176. And here we're trying to make sure that there's advanced discussion with schools, childcare facilities, and talking about health and safety related issues if you're going to have these facilities. And then there is a code reference in my other document that we can provide at the RCW or state level for your review. Turning back to page 169 is the whole quasi-judicial process. Tiffany's already mentioned that, but we are incorporating that into the code since it's now been adopted by the City Council. All right. Now the big stuff, in my opinion, begins on page 187, and that's the land uses and interpretation tables. And in the current code, what you do is you go to one chapter and you find out what type of use is allowed, and then you go to another chapter to find out whether it's allowed in that zone, and is it principally permitted administrative or conditional use permit. It's difficult to use. A lot of people understandably get confused, so we tried to put it in the form of a table. And so you'll see that for the first time beginning on page 189, and it's either P for principally permitted, which means it's allowed by right, conditional use permit, and if you have a little H-er in the box, that means it's not allowed. And we begin to see that for agriculture. And then underneath it, you see use-specific development and operating conditions. For example, if you go to agricultural uses, commercial beekeeping, B1, you go down to use-specific development operating conditions, B1, those are the specific requirements for bees and hives, and that's coming out of some recent regulations and the like coming from the state and other groups. But we don't have anything now, and bees have become an important issue, so a lot of people have expressed an interest in that, so we've placed it under the agricultural category, and this is the way in which we try to regulate it to make sure that people don't get stung, and we don't have Africanized bees, and we have all kinds of things for hives, and if you're transporting hives, you got to do it pretty quick so that the bees don't get out and sting people. So we've tried to incorporate all that level of detail into this. The one that gets really kind of hairy is on commercial and industrial uses. We have all brand new definitions, for example, accessory retail or artisan shop, auto and vehicle sales and rental. All these are new definitions that have been incorporated into the code. We've tried to take what's in the existing code and match it with these proposed new definitions as much as possible. Is it a complete match? No, but I think this is better to use for the general public than what we're currently doing. Under the current code, you might have retail use levels 1, 2, and 3. We've done away with that. And so in some ways, we've simplified this. And so I wanted to make sure that the commission was aware of it. The other thing that I would like to point out is when we get to eating and drinking establishments on page 201, you'll see B3 talked about at length. B3 are the requirements for drive-through facilities. This is new. And there are new requirements for drive-throughs. And this is becoming more and more of an issue because our streets become more and more trafficked with more and more vehicles. Ingress and egress in and out of commercial vehicles is becoming more of an issue. So we're trying to kind of lay down some rules and regulations for fast food restaurants or drive-throughs in general. So please take a look at this. I think it's pretty significant. I wanted to bring it to you. I'm on page 203, and it goes to 205. The next one is we've rewritten the definitions for OSR, open space regulations. And I need to talk to Tiffany about this because at the bottom of 217, we have a table that's blank. And we need, and then I go back and take a look at the other tables it's filled in. So we need to kind of look at that, but that is a change.
So those tables are formatted much differently than the previous ones?
Yes.
I guess what's?
Because we only have two open space designations, OSR1 and OSR2.
Okay. What, sorry, the tables below that, the permitted, administrative, and conditional. The other ones where it was permitted, or it was not allowed, or it was conditional.
We need to go back and fix the table. You'll see, we'll change the format to make sure it matches everything else.
Oh, okay.
This one has been a little bit more difficult to write, and so we've struggled with it, and so we'll be asking the Planning Commission and the City Council to look at this, because we have a lot of different activities in both zones. OSR1 is a little bit more restrictive, and OSR2 is less restrictive. And so we don't want to go too far and go, we want to make sure we're not prohibiting certain things in Fort Steilacoom Park, for example. So we need to look at that carefully.
Now, I had a question on 210. Let me go back there. So the maintenance shops and vehicle equipment, so that's allowed in C1 and allowed in C3, but not allowed in C2. if it's allowed in the other two, I guess why wouldn't it be allowed in C2? What's the,
Which page are you on again?
210, 18A 4070, the government services? Looks like C3 was added and then it's conditionally allowed in C3 and it was allowed in C1 but not in C2, so I was just,
Okay.
that was kind of the only one that stuck out to me, like all the other ones were, it was typically
C-
allowed.
C3 is a specialized zone specific to the Walmart property, and so we have placed more restrictions on the C3 zone than the C1 and C2
Thanks.
on purpose.
Then there's a lowercase p in that table too. So.
Okay. On the accessory dwelling units, which is going to be starting on page 224, it talks about accessory dwelling units being allowed in the R1 through R4 zones. And then if you begin going under operating and development conditions on 225, there's most of this is the same as the current code, but we are expanding the size of the ADU, I believe, for 2,000 square feet or 40% of the size of the living space. And so that allows for a significantly large ADU, and that's in relationship to some changes that the state has proposed as part of means of promoting affordability. We also need to go back and take a look at this, Tiffany, in relationship to bus stops or bus routes, because if your property is adjacent to a bus route, the state wants us to promote ADUs along that route. So I don't think that's in here, but we'll need to go back and check that. You may not want to do that. It's discretionary, but I thought I'd include it and let you guys talk about it. Let's see. Page 231, mobile and/or manufactured homes. This whole section has been rewritten to come into compliance with state permitting procedures.
Got another comment on where we just were at with the ADUs. B7 isn't used in the table, so.
Okay?
The footnote, you mean?
Yeah.
Page, what page? Is it 228?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, 220, 229.
229.
I also want to advise the commission we've changed the rules and regulations for home occupations. We have type 1 and type 2. Frankly, we have issues with people violating their home occupation permit once it's been issued. So there's been some discussion by city staff to address it by taking away some of the opportunities to use a home occupation permit. That is something that you will want to talk about as a part of this update. The other thing too, and I need to make sure that we put it in here, is we are exempting out internet-related businesses from the home occupation permit requirement because it's just too difficult to track and it has no impact upon neighborhoods. The only issue that we have is making sure they get their business license, and we're working with the state on that process. But one of the efforts that we are making as a part of this code is to try to ease our level of administration, and we have areas we're having to spend too much time on enforcement. My thought would be if we can't get people to comply, we take away the opportunity. You may not agree with that, and that's fine, but we should have a discussion about it because it does impact the current planning department and code enforcement when we have people conducting businesses where they say they're not bringing in trucks and heavy equipment, they're not bringing in employees when in fact they are. And that was not the intent of the home occupation in the first place. It was to get the business started, to keep it low key, and not to have major impacts upon the neighborhood. And so it's important to have a further discussion on that. I just want to bring it to your attention tonight. The air corridor zones. That begins on page 244. This is one area that you're going to want to spend a lot of time on. And this has been completely rewritten in a manner to reflect the most recent air installation compatible use zone report of 2015. It introduces the concept of FAR, or floor area ratio, which has to do with the size of the building on the lot itself. And you have a definition of that on page 244 and 245. And I will need to talk to Tiffany on that one. Do you want to include the definitions on this section or include it in the definition section? That's one thing that we need to talk about. But you'll begin to see on page 247 land use categories. We've tried to match the land use categories with the proposed land use categories in the new update, but also try to match them with the ACUS report, and also try to take into account what the existing uses are, so that we're trying to bring it all together in one fashion. So you'll want to spend some time looking at this. You'll notice that many types of residential uses are not going to be permitted in APZ 1, 2, and the clear zone. And then on pages 248 and 249, you begin to see what types of permitted uses are allowed. I will tell you that there has been an expansion of allowable uses in the air corridor zones through the ACUS report, provided you have the FAR requirement, a part of it.
Mr. Buer, can you look at 245 on number 3? It says they're more than, and it's blank and yellow, but acres. Is that going to have a acreage in there on page 245 on item number 3? It says they're more than, and in yellow it says blank.
Yeah.
Acres.
Waiting for a number.
Yeah, that's all we're doing. I think we have the number. I believe our GIS department has that.
No
We just haven't put it
problem.
in.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Quick comment on that.
Yes.
So typically, are all of the definitions in 18A the definitions section, or do you have them? I guess that can get confusing when you're going through, and then sometimes you have definitions in the actual code section, and then if you go back to look at 18A and they're not there, then.
The intent is to, the intent is to have it all in 18A10, 180.
Yeah.
And so we were just talking about, there's some stuff in here that got missed, so we need to drop it into 18A10.
We've gone back and forth on definitions. If it's very specific to a section that people makes it more user-friendly, just put the definitions in that section, or just put it in the front and just leave it there.
Yeah.
So after a lot of discussion, we decided just to put it in the front and leave it there.
Yeah.
The transportation land use table and the utilities, this really reflects your current code. We just placed it in the form of a table. Marijuana prohibited on page 258. This is basically what the city council has previously adopted. So it has its own section within the new code. Beginning on page 260, the flood, the overlay districts. This is exactly out of your current code, so there are no changes. The section dealing with the sexually oriented businesses was part of a legal settlement, so we're not making any changes to that. One of the things we have changed is on page 289. We've tried to incorporate all the overlay zones into a map as part of the code. And then on page 292, this has been a real bugaboo with a lot of people, and that's what are the development standards for each of the different zones, and here we put it into a form of a table, so it's just a whole lot easier to read. And then we did the same thing for commercial development. All of this is the same regulations that we currently have, the same for industrial, military lands, open space. We might want to go back and just check open space. Beginning on page 299, we talk about public institutional. We have discussion on what's a legally created lot. That's out of our current code. The rest of this, up until parking, I will say this, on landscaping. The current code is very difficult to read when it comes to landscaping. This is starting on page 331. So we created them some simple tables. And so you have a commercial building design, and then you have all the standards to the right, where before this was all kind of mushed together and it was very difficult to read. So this is just a simple technique that we've tried to use to improve readability. All of these standards have not changed, except has it deal with lighting, and I'll get to that in a minute. The landscaping standards have not changed. That's on page 357. Under tree preservation, this is our current code. There are two changes here that I would like to mention. One is found on page 376 on the maximum tree removal on developed properties. We're actually expanding the number of trees a person can remove on certain size lots. In the past, we have kept the number very small, and it's actually created some problems. And we spent a lot of time on tree removal permits and enforcement, as well as ticketing people. So the thought was to ease our level of administration and provide a little greater flexibility. That's maybe something the council commission may not want, but I wanted to point that out. Then on page 378.
Mr. Buer, excuse me, Mr. Guerrero.
Sorry. Regarding the tree removal, in my memory, it was under 17,000 actually didn't have a limitation. So that is new. Now the limitation is 2. Is that correct? Okay.
Up to,
Current,
There was a species limitation too, wasn't there?
Go ahead, Mr. Guerrero, clarify.
current code, if your lot was under 17,000 square feet, you didn't have a limitation on the number of trees you could remove. You still have to get permits, I believe, but you could remove them. And now it's
under 17,000 square feet, you do not, people get a tree removal permit just because it helps with neighborhood issues, and it's greatly appreciated. But if you have, I believe, a limitation on the number of trees that you can remove at 17,000 square feet. So we've given more flexibility by allowing the removal of more trees. And so we've established that chart as a process to provide that flexibility. And I can go back and show you the current code to show you the difference. But that was an effort to improve the situation because we get into so many issues with street trees and tree preservation. We get into some real problems often around the lakes with a significant number of trees on large lots, and it gets very difficult to remove them. And so this was an opportunity or an effort to see if we can alleviate that concern. Now, we also have a way in which if you remove trees, you can pay for fees. You can pay $400 per tree at a 2-to-1 ratio, and so we end up collecting a lot of money sometimes. The last time I checked, we had over $100,000. So we use that to go out and plant trees or put trees in the parks and so forth. So in order to account for that, on page 378, you see a city tree fund. Mm-hmm. So I tried to codify that this is how you can, this is what we're doing on that. To better track the use and expenditure of money. Parking, we've added some new requirements. Particularly, you're going to see something called transportation demand management. It's an opportunity to reduce parking. Also, too, you see some new tables that are more expansive in regarding to parking standards. And I would just, since we have the individual from the Lakewood Industrial Park, so that you know, the warehouse use is per 1,000 square feet of gross floor area is 1 parking space. Just 1. We'll talk later. And then there's a requirement for office space as well, but that's the section that you and I need to speak on in the follow-up conversations. And so you'll know what we're doing is we're looking at the code in relationship, the new code in relationship to existing uses to see if it all works out right and that we don't end up creating non-conforming uses. And so that's why these conversations are important. Then we have some new tables that show you the dimension requirements for new parking. The housing incentives program already exists in our code. There are no changes there. And the wireless services facilities, and then the sign code, which has been adopted by the City Council. So there's been a lot of reorganization and introduction of new things and an attempt to try to incorporate tables and the like. There's an ongoing effort on my part to see if we can't put more pictures into this, and we'll see how that comes out. But that's a real quick Dave Buer synopsis of the major changes in the code and things you might want to be careful and watchful for.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, appreciate it, yeah. A lot of writing, Mr. Guerrero, you get it all written down there? Any questions for Mr. Buer?
Yes. These are my notes from before. On page 236, confidential shelter. Yeah, confidential shelter, maximum of 15 residents plus resident staff is allowed throughout residential and MF zones. Is that new that it's identified? The reason I'm asking is so in a residential, so say in an R1 or R2 zone, you're allowed to have 15 residents in a confidential shelter?
Can you give me just a moment?
Sure.
What page were you at?
236 has the table, and confidential shelter is the second item on it.
I believe this is something that came out of a requirement by the state. Yeah, means a temporary lodging and supportive services offered by a community-based domestic violence program to victims of domestic violence and their children. And that's the definition, which is found on page 61. Technically, this is basically a group home. And as a group home, it is considered to be an essential public facility. So there's not a way or a means by which the city can deny the request. It is confidential, which means they try to keep it somewhat secret so that they don't end up with issues of domestic violence. You may not be aware of this, but there are quite a few of these in the city of Tacoma. They're difficult to cite. They are facilities that people don't talk about very much, but I thought it'd be appropriate to include it in because it is something that comes up from time to time.
Yeah, so there's no question that they're needed and appropriate. I guess what I was curious about was the number of people. If you have 15 people plus a staff member, I don't think that remains confidential very long in a single-family neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. Are you suggesting that you'd like to see a lower number?
Well, that would be if 15 didn't come from a federal mandate or something like that, yes, something more like what group homes have, it's 6 or 7 make more sense to me, but I'm not, if we're required to have it, so be it, but if we're not, it seems like a smaller number makes more sense.
We do have a group home currently being used as for domestic violence victims in a single-family neighborhood with 10 individuals. And it's operated by a legitimate business or nonprofit organization. We do get complaints from the neighborhood about the number of cars and the number of children. It's a large house, and it is able to accommodate that number of people.
So probably something to think about there. Page 223, duplexes? So it's in the chart, and it's shown as a conditional use in R4, and I think currently it's not a conditional use, is that correct?
Which one is, what page?
Duplexes in an R4 zone show as a conditional use permit, and I think right now they're permitted outright. Was there an intent that you just want to have more control over it? 223 is the table.
We've had some issues in the past with the way in which we define single-family, duplex, three or more, four or more, and such. And so we changed that definition, and the idea was to try to keep some level of control for higher density in that zone, and thus a conditional use permit requirement. Now, in recent state legislation, and this may be coming forward in 2020, a mandate that requires that single-family and duplex be allowed in all residential zoning districts.
That would be something. My last comment is on the lighting. It seemed like that might have been kind of started out of the air corridor requirements, but it does apply everywhere.
Yes.
So just something that we should read and make sure that we understand. I see that in a lot of jurisdictions where there are lighting level requirements and those type of things, so I think it's reasonable, but pay attention to it.
Any other questions for Mr. Buer? Thank you for the recap.
And I anticipate that you will have more questions, so that's fine.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Brandstetter?
Thank you, Mr. Buer. Just for the benefit of the commission and myself, this is scheduled for a public hearing on September 4th. And we're going to make changes between now and September 4th. So when is the document that the public's supposed to comment on going to sort of be set to be the topic of that hearing?
It will be what is included in the Planning Commission's packet the week prior. So it'll be the 28th of August is when that packet will be released.
Okay, so the packet on the 28th is what the public could reasonably refer to, and the commission members and myself could pre-read so that we can absorb the comments.
Correct, yes, yes.
Thank you.
And if I could as well, Mr. Chair, the way the schedule is currently set, the public hearing is scheduled for September 4th, and then you do have September 18th, and then any other additional sessions where you, if you want to have continued discussion about it before you take action, you're certainly able to do that.
And continued public hearing too. So there's lots of options here. We may not have everything done, and if that's the case, I will certainly recommend that the commission continue the hearing.
That was my only question. I thought in reference to, it was a public hearing on September 18th, but then it reverted to September 4th. Maybe just a continuance of September 18th if we had more questions, comments, and concerns.
Yes, I apologize if there's a mention of it, September 18th as a hearing date for this topic. What we have right now is on the 4th would be an 18A hearing. On the 18th will be the hearing on that rezone that I mentioned at the start of the meeting.
Oh.
And then, should you want to, of course, you can continue the 18A public hearing.
That was the conflict. Suburban Times mentioned today
Yes.
that the September 4th would be the public hearing on the rezone of those 6 parcels.
And that's an error, yes, yes.
Okay.
We'll be sending out a correction on that, yes.
I was confusion of.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's correct. Okay, thank you.
And the reason we put these dates together is because we're trying to coordinate it with city council review and city council packets, and their packets are full. So we put these dates in just as kind of placeholders, but if you need more time, you just need to say so, and that's fine.
Okay, hearing no more on that, I need to get back to my agenda on all these other. Thank you so much. Current agenda. Okay, current agenda. So, reports from Mr. Brandstetter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. just several things that I wanted to make the commission aware of. That the city is easing into enforcement of the revisions to the sign code. We're really in a period of where for some of the things that need to be changed, that owners of signs are being notified and giving time to either arrange for an alternative strategy to the existing sign or do that. But it's a work in progress, but we're in an education give notice phase, okay, rather than a strict enforcement phase to do that. The other thing that I would comment on, and I might ask Ms. Spear to embellish, that the Puget Sound Regional Council is within a commenting period regarding the Vision 2050, which has rippling and real effects in communities across the 4 counties that we have. At its core, it's a transportation issue, but it also then spreads out into housing and employment and other areas covered by the GMA. So there are a lot of conversation and comments going on about should we just sort of build on and keep moving in the direction that we have been with the 2040 vision and extrapolate that with more detail and requirements into 2050, or is there a need to make some changes in direction and policy about how we're going to do that? And of greatest concern to communities in Pierce County, including Lakewood, really have to do with how to get away from a jobs in King County, residences in other counties model, and a transportation system that supports that model. This is something that's going on, that we're both dealing with a consolidated letter from the Pierce County folks that Lakewood is signing on, as well as our own letter. And our letter is due September 16th, and perhaps we could share the draft of our letter or of the other letters, because it does have a lot of long-term impact on planning that I think would be of interest to the commissioners, or at least will make your eyes glass over. To be able to go and do that. But it is important, because in future comprehensive plan issues where as we've discussed today, where we've had to make changes because of mandates from Olympia, that this is also a place that creates those sorts of things that drive what has to be in codes and comprehensive plans. And while this is a once every 10-year juncture, and perhaps if it was available to the commissioners for the September 4th meeting, we might glean a few gems from them to include in our letter. That's all I really have that's germane, I think. But I'm willing to answer any questions if you're curious as to what the council is up to or why.
Not at this time. I don't see any comments at this time, Mr. Brandstetter. Thank you. How about reports from our staff?
You've heard plenty tonight. We'll just continue down the path of 18A. The next meeting will be September 4th, so after Labor Day weekend, and that will be the open hearing, the hearing on 18A, and then there'll be several other items on the agenda related to actually starting in on the 2020 comprehensive plan cycle. So it'll be a light touch kind of coming in at the 50,000 foot level. And then jumping to September 18th, it'll be the hearing on that rezone of the 6 parcels of the Fort Steilacoom Golf Course, discussion on 18A as desired, and then we will have the docket for the 2020 comp plan cycle ready for you to look at by that point. And again, that's not the huge review that you just got done with the 19 cycle. This is just providing a recommendation to the council on what the docket will include for further review. So we'll provide to you all of the private or city-initiated applications. You make a recommendation to council to look at that. And then we'll be in October already.
Yes, Mr. Bueller?
At some point, we'd like to share with you the buildable lands report and a discussion on residential densities in the city of Lakewood.
Any other reports from fellow commissioners? Hearing or seeing none, if that's it, we'll call, yes, Mr. Bueller.
Please get in touch with me and Tiffany, and we would be happy to sit down and go through it in detail to make sure that there's a level of comfort with what we're doing here.
Right, no problem, I appreciate that. Seeing or hearing no more comments, we'll have meeting adjourned.